so far. Hospitality has been awesome. Even turned the rain on to make me feel at home, so thank you. Today I'm here to talk to you about SAP. I know our founder, Mariano, good friends of mine, been here before, and said that you guys like hacking SAP, so we'll start. Okay, my name is Dave Hartley. I work for MWR Labs. We do some cool stuff, you should check it out. I'm Check and Crest certified, which are two schemes in the UK, sort of benchmark testers and things. I'm also a Crest assessor, so I'm part of that scheme. If you've never heard about it, go and check it out, it's Crest.org. Co-author of a book, and I've written a few SAP modules. Okay, everything I'm going to talk to you about today, for the most part, is not my research. I began putting this talk together really as an education piece for the internal team. And what I did, I had to go from sort of zero to hero in no time to start testing SAP systems. So I went to these guys' sites, their presentations, their research material, and basically what I've done is condensed it down, build a testing kit, basically to make hacking SAP that little bit much more easier. So these guys really deserve credit for everything that more effort. Okay, this talk is just enough education to home, zero to hero type stuff. SAP is so ginormous, it's got a massive attack surface, and there's just too much stuff to cover in a 1 hour slot. So hopefully I'm just going to give you snippets of information and whet your appetite to look into it a little bit more. But hopefully you shouldn't need a deep understanding to understand how easy it is to break in. I'm going to cover a little bit of a background around SAP, just some core components that you really need to understand, but again without going into too much detail. An overview of what the infrastructure and the landscape of the SAP system looks like, and then some core system components such as the database. Then I'm going to detail some of the attack surface that's available in how you connect to the SAP system and how other systems interconnect. And then getting down into the depths of SAP, the transactions, reports and programs is really how the entire thing operates, so it's important to just have a basic understanding of that. And I'm going to cover some of the Web 2.0 stuff that SAP have been doing, but again, there's like 3 or 4 talks out that detail this in much more detail. I just can't cover everything, but I'll give you a couple of snippets of easy wins. Okay, quick SAP primer. SAP is one of the largest software companies in the world. Their products focus on ERP. There's 5 major application platforms, and you'll find that pretty much most businesses make use of SAP in some way, shape or form, and it's an integral piece of kit to their entire operations. The common setups are ECC, CRM, PLM, blah blah blah. They're all pretty much different packages for different businesses and give them a different piece of functionality. But the attack surface is pretty much common across all platforms, and right at the core it operates the same way. So a lot of these modules and attacks that I demonstrate today should work against any of these instances. Okay, SAP GUI. If you're going to be looking at SAP systems, this is a piece of kit you need to get familiar with. This is the primary way of users actually interact with SAP systems. It's a thick client that runs on the desktop, and basically everything in SAP is built around ABAP or Java, predominantly ABAP. And this is a way to execute ABAP code. Although the user doesn't see it as that, they just use drop-down menus, click buttons, things like that, but in the background, little ABAP functions will execute. There's also, these days, the Web GUI, so they don't even need to install something on the desktop. They can just go to a web portal or a web address, and they get exactly the same as they would on the desktop, just through the web browser. And it's all done by an ITS server that translates the GUI screens into web screens. And you've got this thing, which is quite a power users tool. And within this, it's kind of like the SAP GUI runs on Windows, but you can have the SAP GUI embedded in it. You can also have different types of applications running that are custom or from SAP, and it's got its own attack surface really. Okay, to connect and interact with SAP systems pragmatically, typically what you need to do is make use of an SDK that's available from SAP to talk over something called RFC, which is just a way of remotely calling ABAP functions. The SDK is written in C, C++. There's 2 versions, there's the classic and there's the NetWeaver version. There are slight differences between the 2, which I'll cover in some detail later. There's a bunch of third-party wrappers available. I personally use the Ruby one from Martin Serranio, but depending on your skill set and the programming language that you prefer, there's plenty of wrappers and plenty of choice for you to start playing around with this sort of stuff. Okay, if you're testing a SAP system, what do you want to get out of it? If you're doing a network, you're looking for root. If you're doing an application test, you're looking for some sort of admin type access. In a SAP system, there's going to be operating system accounts, and they are prefixed with a 3-letter identifier, which signifies the SAP system. So it could be AA, BBC, blah, blah, blah. There's also a DBA account for the database that supports the SAP system, and then there's a SAP user himself that you access through the SAP application layer, which has a privilege model as well, and that privilege that can be assigned to the highest user is SAP all. If you can gain any of these, either a SID AEN user, a DBA, or a user that's got SAP all privileges, then it's going to be trivial to get any of the other two. Before I continue, each one of my slides that details an attack or a vulnerability contains a SAP note on there, which is a reference number, kind of akin to a Microsoft Knowledge Base article. I don't know the content of any of those SAP notes. Apparently they either fix the vulnerability or give you a workaround. The SAP charge for access to that. And basically the way that they charge for that is you have to be a paying customer with a full-blown SAP implementation, paying your subscription fees and your license fees before you can access those notes. Or you have to be a qualified and certified SAP administrator working for one of those companies and jump through a few hoops before you can get access to it. I fit none of the above, and I've asked and they told me no. So take it all with a pinch of salt. Okay. Infrastructure and landscape. Typically SAP systems have an M-tier structure. You can have an application server, a gateway, database, user. There's all sorts of different configurations you can get. Typically, always you can have some way of connecting into it, but that's pragmatically whether it's the SAP GUI, either thick on the client, thick installation, or through the web. You can have multiple instances of SAP GUI, so you can have at least 100 going from 00 to 99, and then within that you can have clients which is up to 1,000, and you can have multiple database instances and application stacks running on the same sort of systems, and obviously you can virtualize it all as well. This is an oversimplified illustration of what a topology can look like. Here we've got an internet connection coming through an internet firewall, through into either a web dispatcher or a SAP router. Now, a SAP router is kind of like a network level proxy filter, and web dispatcher is the same but for application protocols. Internally, you've got your user there coming through with whatever connector, in this case a SAP GUI, through the firewall, back out into the DMZ, and then you've got the application server and database server relationship. Landscapes are something typical to SAP, and basically, as a minimum, you usually see a three-tier landscape. It's going to be dev, QA, and prod. You can see prod and pre-prod and things like that, and there's supposed to be a separation, almost segregation of these systems. At a bare minimum, there needs to be a transport layer between each three, and the reason that transport layer is there is to move changes from dev through into QA, through into the prod system, and this is done through a mechanism called CTS, the Change and Transport System. And those transports live in a CTD, which is a Change and Transport Directory, which is usually a file system share, whether it's NFS or Windows Server shares and things like that. Okay, there's the changes that are migrated usually configuration or ABAP code, but in CTS Plus, you can also move over non-SAP related objects, Java code, things like that. Now, if you can access to those shares and manipulate that data, then usually there's no CRC checks and things like that done on it. You could probably put it in your backdoor and Trojan code, but it's not for the faint-hearted. It's quite proprietary, a lot of it, and if you start messing about with it on an actual client system, then you're likely to break the entire thing and someone's going to try and take a contract out on you. So if you do play with this stuff, play with stuff and all that, but it is possible. If you're on a network and you come across these transports, NFS, it has to be shared for everyone in the environment, and typically they're usually mounted without the no-suit option set. I want to teach anyone to suck eggs, but that is a really easy thing to break into. Databases. Okay, I'm not going to go into detail about how to hack databases. Again, this is kind of one-on-one stuff. These are the databases that are typically supported by SAP and that you'll come across in any sort of SAP environment. They're listed in an order of frequency that I see them. The most popular database I see is Oracle, then Microsoft, then MaxDB. I've actually never seen an instance of DB2 or Sybase or anything like Doesn't mean they're not out there, but they're not that common to me. I'll detail one thing about Oracle that you should be aware of that is a bygone age really, is Oracle needs to be configured to support the remote OS authent parameter set to true. This basically means that it trusts the operating system has authenticated the user that's connecting, so therefore it thinks it doesn't need to. So you can use your own system to create a user, and that user will be trusted. Again, the SAP notes at the bottom apparently fix this, but I don't know. Okay, the easy way to gain access to an Oracle database server that supports this parameter is to create your own TNS SORA file, create the user, SU to that user, and then just using C++ gain in. And 99% of the time when I come across Oracle systems, this always works. SAP MaxDB is built on MySQL, and it's a SAP proprietary database. It also has a similar concept to the Oracle Remote OS Authent thing. If your user has a file in their home directory or can read this file, xuser62, then they can also authenticate to the database without supplying any credentials. This file is sort of binary format, but you can read it using either a text editor, sometimes you can pull it out, or you can use, I forget the name of the utility, there's a utility on the box that will pull out the contents. But basically contained in there is a list of users that are configured in the database and keys that correspond with those users. You can see the query at the bottom using the DBM GUI utility, and the highlighted character C is all you have to supply to connect to that database as a super user. So if you can gain access to the operating system that the database is on, then you can become a DBA and start interrogating the database behind the SAP system. Connectivity into SAP systems. Okay, typically you can connect in using SAP GUI, Windows, Java, so you can run it on OS X, you can run it on Linux. If the web GUI is enabled, then you can use a browser, and then there's the remote function calls, and then there's a whole host of applications such as visual admin, mobile client, etc. Now, all of these either use the same protocols or they use some other custom protocols. There's quite a wealth of them, but the most common ones you'll come across are the web GUI and the SAP GUI. And popular now are a lot of desktop applications that are coming out from different companies that say they'll make it really easy for you to import and export and manipulate and process and consume data from SAP systems. And all of those applications, they say they've got plugins for XLS, they'll do this, you can do it in your browser, you can do it using their custom binary, etc. But they all use RFC in the background. So a lot more people are opening up the RFC connectors to their local networks, which is a silly thing to do. Okay, now the comms that are in use, the GUI traffic is using a protocol called DIAG, which is a proprietary protocol to SAP, and it's just compressed, and then there's tons of tools out now that will decompress it for you. There's even Wireshark dissectors, there's man-in-the-middle tools, it's not complicated. You can start messing with this traffic using some of the escapee classes that just came out from Core Security. If you want to play with this, check those out. You can encrypt this traffic using SAP's own version of like SSL TLS called SNC. Not a lot of people do. The latest client out now actually supports this, so people are starting to turn it on, but historically none of this traffic would be encrypted, it would be flowing across the internet and local nets unencrypted. You just have to decompress it. Web GUI stuff, the credentials are just base 64 encoded, typically over HTTP. No one really likes to deal with HTTPS. The RFC traffic itself uses the DIAG protocol as well, which is compressed, but the credentials are XORed. The credentials are XORed with a fixed key that's been publicly known for several years. So again, that's not trivial. If you can capture the traffic on the wire, you can start to decompress and decrypt the credentials. Decrypt. So, visual admin itself uses P4, but that's basically just the same as Java RMI. So if you've ever done any playing with Java RMI objects, or seen RMI Spy that came out a couple of years ago, and that's stuff that's really fun to play with. And all the mitigations for that is just a tunnel or SSL, which not a lot of people do. SAP router. If you go back to visually the diagram that I showed with the SAP router sitting behind a firewall, the network level proxy, this thing is going to be present in all SAP systems, simply because SAP in Germany mandate that they need to be able to access your systems to do remote admin and support and things. And the SAP router is what facilitates that access. Even if there's no remote access enabled for users of the corporation SAP system, the SAP router will exist in the network. And if they've got the configuration right, then only SAP should come in. but often they don't get the configuration right. Also, you find it in the DMGs as a proxy filter coming through from a local LAN or a partner network. It's a very basic, just ACL. It filters source, destination, IP address, protocol, does some logging. It can be used to enforce password protected connections, and it can also be used to enforce the encryption. This is what one of the ACLs look like. They're pretty simple to follow: source, destination, service, password. You can wildcard the service, you can wildcard and subnet the source and destination addresses. In older versions of the SAP router kernel, if you started the service, what that typically meant was that any protocol and any port could be communicated with. What it now actually means in the newer kernels is that only any SAP protocol, or they call it secure protocol, but I prefer SAP because it's not secure. You see on the left-hand side the key there for P for commit, S to say that it's only a SAP protocol, and D for deny at the end. The amount of times I've audited one of these and found a good 150 rules that I've spent ages going through, only to get to the bottom and see a star commit because someone got sick of maintaining it or doing something with it. Like I say, in older versions, you've just got star for service. And the interesting thing about these as well is if you go to your firewall admin guy and you say you want to punch a hole in his firewall to allow remote connectivity into a SAP system, he's like, well, I'm not sure how many ports do you want, what do you want? He says, oh, just one. Just port 3299, that's all. And he thinks, well, what's the worst that could happen? I'll show you. Okay, so SAP routers, if misconfigured, you can send them an info request to basically ask it, who have you got currently connected through you, whose connections you maintain, and you get a state table back. So if you send the state table that comes back will allow you to identify SAP systems that are behind the DMZ that might be in a different address range, isn't necessarily directly routable. It'll also tell you about other clients that may be connected through the same SAP router on a local network, may be giving you an attack path through. And if the router itself is misconfigured, you can start to port scan those systems and communicate with them, all through just one port being open on the firewall. I crafted a Metasploit module to demo this. All this is doing is just firing an admin request back at the SAP router. What comes back is its state table. Also comes back the name of the file that's being used, the directory that it's running in, that can let you know which operating system it's running on. What we got there is source SAP router, so there's another SAP router connecting through to a gateway on port 3242 on a network that's not internet routable. Now it's a good time to mention Bisploit. I'm sure if Mariano was here a few years ago, you're aware of his work and what he did. He built a Python framework for testing SAP connectors, particularly a lot of the modules were designed about RFC. It's written in Python and C, and there's about 28 plugins there. He's not updated the framework for a long time, and that's why I started writing these Metasploit modules, because I'm not that good at Python, I'm not that good at Ruby, to be honest. But no one else seems to be contributing back to his framework. I figured there'd be a lot more people out there willing to get involved with the Ruby Metasploit framework. As it happens, I've been talking to him quite a lot, and what he's now decided to do is put a lot of the stuff that I've done back into his own framework, and he's done a lot more cool stuff as well. So I think next week he's going to put out a release with some pretty cool stuff in there. Now, what he did in 2010 when he was presenting this stuff was talk about two particular plugins that was particularly interested to me, which would allow him to detect if native connections were possible, and also to establish native proxy connections through the router, but he never released them. I do believe he's going to release them next week now, because I've been bugging him about it, but I needed to write my own. The first place I went to was his code, found the plugins weren't there, went to SAP's website and looked through their documentation, and I found this information on the root packet structure that outlined the structure of sending the routing messages through. And the interesting thing there is the talk mode. I don't know if you see that. That's 5 or 6 down. The talk modes weren't detailed, but there was a rough description against one of them that caught my eye, which was the NI raw IO mode, which said that there would be no other manipulation or viewing of the data that you tried to send through as a talk mode packet. So I figured that was a good place to start. It was, and I wrote a module that will construct these types of packets, fire them at the router at any address you give it, and this allows us to communicate with hosts that are behind the SAP router using native protocols if it supports it, if not just SAP protocols. So you can now start to port scan any systems that are in a SAP DMZ behind a SAP router, whether that's from the local net or the internet. That first scan there is against a SAP gateway, and you see I've enumerated all SAP services. The second one there is against a Windows XP system using native protocols, signified by the third column along the table. So now we can proxy through, now we can scan through the firewall, and we can also enumerate networks. Now, I'm lazy and I've already got a toolbox for doing pen tests. I don't really want to write a whole bunch of tools for repeating the same work. So I spoke with the Metasploit guys about the best way to implement this proxy into their framework, so that we can use every other plugin that's in the framework as a pen test. So you guys don't even have to think about it. You just type set proxies, it'll tunnel everything to the router, and you can do a normal pen test. Pretty simple to use. All you got to do is type set proxies, and then it's a demo of us running an interpreter payload from the internet through a SAP router against a Windows XP station on a local area network. I said all you have to do is type one more command and use to type in. And there's a screenshot of the desktop that's behind the firewall. SAP GUI. I sort of mentioned it at the beginning, it's a Windows executable on Java. Uses diag, can be encrypted, etc. Now the GUI itself, whilst it's a tool that you can go and click and execute buttons and transactions, it can also be scripted. So specifically on Windows systems, there's a lot of ActiveX objects. You can automate a lot of the types of things that you're doing. There's about 1,000 ActiveX controls on Windows. Now, a lot of them historically have had all sorts of vulnerabilities in them, buffer overflows, memory corruption, command execution, yada yada yada. Now, SAP's way of dealing with that was just to implement the kill bit, so that you can't call it remotely, so it's not valid for drive-by attacks. But if you're running systems on the local network and you get stuff into the internet, it's a valid vector. Also, if you pop in boxes and you're on there and you're using post-exploitation techniques, then you can start to wrap these ActiveX controls up into your own custom VBS scripts and start using them to brute force and leverage the capabilities of this SAP GUI tool that's in front of you. There's lots of functionality that's there as feature sets that you can abuse, such as downloading files, reading, writing, complete files, and all of it's quite well documented. You can even execute commands locally and remotely on SAP systems. Now, users can find that using SAP on a daily basis is quite boring and laborious. Actually, to start it up, to log in, to go to where you need to be, to start using the transaction or the form that you used to. And you can save yourself a little bit of time by creating a shortcut and saving it to the desktop. And if you don't like entering passwords, you can also save that, so you can just double click and it straight to where you want. Now, previous versions of the GUI, that password was just encoded and stored on the file system or in the registry. You can pull it out and decode it trivially. Newer versions, it's encrypted. I do know people that have been working on this, but there's nothing public out, as far as I know at the moment, to decrypt the credentials. But what's also listed in there is all the servers that they connect to, the connectors that they use. So if you get onto a SAP system, and rather than scanning the network and looking for other systems, you can look through that configuration file and identify other systems that that user at least has access to. There's one of my friends who also, when he did a SAP engagement, knew nothing about SAP, you could just key log as well and gain access to all those extra systems. The GUI itself supports a whole bunch of functions that can be called. So if you inject yourself into a man-in-the-middle connection between a user and the SAP system, you can start calling these functions. And there's some tool sets that are available that allow you to do that and automate it somewhat. Tool set from SensePost. But some of the functions you can call can allow you to flip around and get the client to execute commands, get the server to execute commands, all sorts of directory listings. There's a wealth of stuff there. To be honest, really need to check out a tool called SAP Prox, which is kind of like Burp for SAP diag traffic, and it also supports external Python scripts, so you can write your own little Python or Java attack scripts that will automatically launch when you're doing a man-in-the-middle attack. Martin Gallo from Core Labs has also just released a whole bunch of scaping classes that you can start to do this yourself and set up road servers and things. So there's some interesting stuff that I'm working with them to sort of start porting some of this to the Ruby for Metasploit, but at the moment I've made use of their stuff. Some more concepts about SAP. I mentioned at the beginning there's a whole bunch of SAP clients. So if you're testing the SAP system, we've now seen that we can go through the SAP route and identify them, identify the services that they're running. Once we want to start connecting and authenticating and getting a little bit deeper, we need to know the concept of SAP clients. The range is from 000 up to 999, which gives you 1,000 possible configurations. There's at least 3 clients that are always configured in the SAP system. One of them's a support, one of them's for admin and maintenance and creating new clients and things. And then you're going to have some either spotted about or just incrementally throughout, depending on the administrator how they configured it. But it makes it easier if we can brute force them and enumerate how many are there. So when you try and connect, we'll get a verbose error message back telling whether that client exists or not if you go through the RFC connector. So I've got a little module here that you just run against the system and it'll go through the whole 1,000 client range and tell you which ones are valid and which ones are existing. It takes a little while to run against 1,000. But the usefulness of this means that this only works via RFC, by the way. If you try and use it through the web GUI, it's not so good. And still to play with DIAG, see if you can do the same thing. Once you've enumerated the clients and the system and the connectors, you're going to want to brute force and look for default users and passwords. Now, most systems are configured with a lockout threshold of 5. There is a way to determine remotely, without authentication, what this setting is, but you need to talk to another service that's on the box. And that service is a web service that's installed by default, and it's a SAP management console. It's a Java-based app that can be called remotely, but normally users will use it on the desktop to determine the health of the system at any one time. And Christian Riley wrote the plugins to basically enumerate the services that are there and call them. And one of the services that you can use starts to pull configuration files back for you, and you can get through those for the lockout threshold. But it's no good if you can't talk to that service. But typically it's going to be around 5. Now also historically what used to happen is the account would automatically unlock after midnight. So if you were going to be brute forcing, do it before midnight, and then when the guy comes in the next morning, then he's not going to lock out the account. I know that something serious has gone on. People are starting to change this now. Default credentials. I've yet to do a SAP assessment where I don't get in with one of these. I've been doing this for a long while, and this table is on the internet everywhere, so everyone should be aware of it. SAP Star user and the DDIT user are quite often users that I get in as. Early watch sometimes is disabled because that's a support user that's in client 066, and it's used by SAP for remote support and administration. A lot of people have got into the habit of disabling it and only enabling it every now and again, but still, it's one that's worth trying. So I wrote another module that will do the automated brute force for you. Again, I've done all this so you don't really have to think about it. Uses a default list, will smash against each client that you give it, either in a range or just an individual one, and come back and tell you whether the user's got the default credentials or not, or whether the account's locked or not. Transactions, reports and programs are the core of any SAP system, so once you've got a SAP system to start attacking, you really need to know how it works. But there's so many different types of transactions, reports and programs in there that no one can really understand how they all work. So I'm trying to get you down to some basic ones. And the concept is that you go into the SAP GUI, you pull up your report, give it some information, some data ranges, and it'll come back and present all the information to you in a list. Others are dialogue programs that you actually interact with and might execute change configurations. But behind the scenes, it's all running some sort of ABAP function. You can also call these transactions and reports from ABAP code just using the call transaction, lead on transaction function. So automatically you can interact with this as well. Also within the SAP GUI on the top left-hand corner is an input field. So users will go in and they've got user context menus based on the privilege levels that they've got. So just like a web application, you've got your user, your manager, and your admin. They'll have different menus for them and different functions they need to execute. And usually the GUI is drawn around their privilege or what they need to do as a job. But in the top left-hand corner is an input field, and if you know the actual code that corresponds with the transaction or report, you can enter it directly there to open it up. Now sometimes the guys that have got the privileges might not have the option in the context menu, but if you're going into the transaction code directly, they may well have access to it. So some fun transactions when you do get some credentials and get a minimum foothold. SM69, SM49, all these allow you to execute and configure operating system commands. It's a demo of using the GUI to go into a SAP system and just pull up this transaction and execute an operating system command. Now this is on Windows. On Windows gateway servers, SM69, SM49, there's a whole list of commands, and they support additional parameters. Now on Windows, those additional parameters you can inject arbitrary commands in using various different meta-character techniques. The techniques employed differ from version to version. For example, this one here is just going in, configuring the command with an additional parameter. See, just an ampersand there to run the command, who am I? Lots of other meta-characters work, so you run as an administrator. Now in newer systems, they try to get rid of some of these meta-characters. I don't think SAP were quite aware of the choice you have of meta-characters to use. So for example, in the latest SAP gateway that's supposed to protect against this, you can still use pipes. Now, by accident rather than design, the Linux system isn't vulnerable to meta-character injection, but there is a way to get that to work, which I'll show you a little later on. Once you've gained a certain level of access, what you're going to do is if you need to elevate or gain access to other clients, is try and get access to the password hashes of users into SAP. Now, the password hashes for users are stored in the user02 and USHO2 tables, stored in B-code and passcode fields. And John the Ripper actually has support for these hash types. You just need to extract them, pre-parse them with a Perl script, and it'll crack them away. Now, typically, these are all the hash types that support it. You're going to come across B and G more often than not, B being limited to 8 characters. So if the password is longer than 8 characters, you need to crack the G hash. But crack the B one first, because then you might be able to write a custom rule for your brute force against your G hash. So John's got a Perl script that once you've exported the data will sort it out. It doesn't always work quite well, so all you do is just extract the name, the B code and passcode fields, stick in a text file, CSV, and then repass it through and it only pulls them out, okay? In order to gain access to the hashes, there's a number of ways you can get to them. One of the easiest ways is to go into the data browser if you've only got access through the GUI, or if you've got access through RFC and run transaction SE16, which will allow you to interrogate SAP database tables and pull back data. What I'm doing is just put in a handy function to export it to a spreadsheet for you. Now, this is only, I've logged in as client 001 here as a SAP star user to pull this data out. It's only pulled out the usernames and passwords hashes for client 001. Now, typically you're going to be interested in getting the password hashes for other clients that are configured. Now, by default, the GUI is imposing this magic where clause in the background to stop you doing that. I'll talk about some ways around that in a minute too. So it didn't take very long to crack those hashes. So the magic where clause that I was saying, it's actually called MANT, short for mandatory. And what it does is anything that you execute, puts a magic where clause on the end that says only pull back data where client ID matches the current client ID. So anything through the GUI is going to try and do that. There used to be quite a few different functions and transactions that execute that wouldn't impose that where clause, but SAP have got quite a lot better at shutting those down. So RFC read table, which is a function that reads data directly in out of the database. Again, that implements it. SQVI, which is kind of a managed SQL function. But exec SQL function that you can execute within ABAP doesn't put this magic where clause in there. So what you're going to try and do is get into a transaction called SE80. It's kind of like an embedded Visual Studio, where you can actually write native ABAP, execute it and run it. And if you can do that, then you can execute native SQL and interrogate the database and pull the hashes out. ABAP itself as well, if you start talking to the database, the source code for the ABAP functions is stored in the database. Now, a lot of functions that are pre-compiled and shipped from SAP might be in a sort of bytecode representation in the database. I talked about the 3 different landscapes, the dev, the QA, and the prod at the beginning. Now, dev QA, you can make changes to your heart's content, and prod, once it's been pushed into production, those changes are forbidden. And those restrictions are imposed on the client side. So you can't go into a production system, into SE80, and start modifying ABAP code unless you go into the database and modify it and do it there, because there's no CRC check from the GUI in the application server when it loads it. So there's one nice way around any restrictions about not making changes. The RFCs, you simply call in one or two of them. I'm going to go into a little bit more deeper about them. And they're just basically independent ABAP code blocks that you can call remotely. There's thousands by default, and then SAP administrators will write their own and deploy them as function calls as well. Every time you call an RFC function, you're going through a sort of gateway that manages the load for other transaction servers, other clients, and things like that. Every SAP system has an instance of a gateway, and that's where you'll start talking to if you're trying to call these RFCs. RFCs themselves can require authentication and have a concept of authorization. So you'll need to be authenticated to talk to them. And in some cases, if you've got quite savvy administrators, you might have to have the appropriate privileges. However, the privilege model, being so granular, is a pain in the ass for administrators to configure. So they'll just give you star permissions as long as you're authenticated. And again, all of this is going across the network, usually in the clear text. The credentials are just XORed. So if you haven't got auth, or you haven't got authorization, just sit there, capture traffic, decode, and decrypt the XOR. There's the key. I'm putting it in this slide yet again because it's all over the internet anyway, but hopefully someone will see it and do something about the silly thing about using XOR and that key. There's a utility that comes with Bisboy, just a little Python script that you can generate these passwords and decode these passwords with. There's a number of RFCs installed by default that don't require authentication that can be quite useful. So RFC.docu, you can use that to enumerate and learn more about RFCs that are installed. They'll come back and you can figure out the structure table and how you need to interact with it and the parameters it expects and what it's going to give back. RFC system info will give you a wealth of info, and I'll do a screenshot in a minute of that. RFC ping, not really that useful, but you can call it remotely, and I think there used to be a bug in it to get more SAT notes on how to fix those. So this is RFC system info, and you can get back from this the host name, the IP address, the operating system, the patch level. Again, that's useful information to pull back from the SAP system without requiring any authentication. It gives you a good idea of what database is supported, where that database might be, a whole host of useful stuff just to start informing your attack. Another function that's available by default, but you still need permission, is RFC remote exec. Now this is installed when you install the actual RFC SDK on a box, which a lot of admin guys do. Now what this allows you to do is call operating system commands remotely, wildcards are permitted, and in the old SDK, remember I said there's two versions, everything is allowed to execute, there's no restrictions, so if it's just been installed, set up and configured, you can execute anything you want to heart's content. Now you can implement an ACL in it, and the ACL is not that difficult to bypass. You just switch uppercase, lowercase, all your usual type of bypass techniques, and it gets right around it. The new one is a default deny policy, so unless there's been an ACL configured, nothing will execute. And if you do configure it and try and put a wildcard in, it won't allow it. So it's much tighter, but at the end of the day, if you're using it to execute operating system commands. I've seen a lot of people do it just to enable SSH or CMD or something like that. So check it out. SAP XPG, this is another fun one. It does the same thing, execute remote operating system commands. This is you maintain the ACL for this for a SecInfo file. Now that SecInfo file is quite robust. However, if you delete it or it doesn't exist, everything's allowed to execute. So there are some vulnerabilities that come out every now and again if you alter your file access or something like that, or you're trying to get into another server and you've got control of the file system. You can just delete that and then execute any operating system command you want. SXPG, this one allows you to automatically call the transaction as showed before, SM69 and SM49, directly from ABAP using like XP command execute. And this is quite useful because what we can now do is pragmatically use this to execute commands on Windows systems and embed an interpreter payload using the meta-character injections to return an interpreter shell, which is a lot easier than keep reloading the GUI and typing stuff in. We're restricted to 256 bytes, and obviously this only works on Windows gateway servers because the same technique doesn't exist on Linux servers at the moment. This is against a 64-bit system, and it's one of the gateway servers you can download from the SAP's website. I have had people test this on newer systems, and it still works. It needs some work for the latest one to use pipes instead of ampersands. Okay, now because we can't do the same command injection on Linux as we can in Windows, it doesn't mean that it's not of any use. If you've got a SAP Gateway Linux system that's using a SAP MaxDB, you can call a predefined database utilities that will dump XUser. That was the utility I was trying to remember earlier. This will dump the contents of that XUser62 file, so you can see what users are set up and what corresponding keys they have. So then you can call the utility, passing it the key that you've just learned, and interrogate the database directly. And if you can do that, then you can get the password hashes out again, as we said before. But the nice thing about doing it this way and using the DBM client utility to talk directly to the database is that we can remove or just not put in that magic where clause. And again, we get the usernames and the password hashes for all clients that are configured on the system, not just the client we've got authentication access to. So imagine if this was 066 and you got in as the support early watch user. You've now got all the password hashes for all the other users across all the other clients. So the data segregation there doesn't really work. Now's probably a good opportunity time to mention a vulnerability that Context IS found and published a few weeks ago. The interesting thing about the vulnerability they found wasn't the vulnerability itself, it was the technique they used to gain command execution. And what they did was abuse the DBM client utility because you can pass it a file that contains operating system commands to execute. And the vulnerability they had allowed them to control the input to that file. So we can use the same technique on Linux and the same utility to get arbitrary operating system command execution. And executing as the SAP ADM user. Another remote function call that's of great use, and SAP don't really acknowledge much, other than saying that it should never have been given away, it was for development purposes, blah blah blah. This function call takes ABAP code directly, so you can write arbitrary ABAP code, it will take it in and it will execute it for you. So you can call it, you can do all the stuff that we've been doing with no restrictions whatsoever. Now, it's disabled in prod systems, but it's not disabled in dev and QA systems. It's actually a pain in the ass to try and disable. I still haven't managed to do it without editing the source code and then just deleting it. But basically, if you can own the dev or the QA system, because I was talking about the transport that exists between for the CTS and CTD, then you've at least got a path of attack there. But also, your dev guys that are using the system, they log into the prod system. So if you own dev or QA, and then use that to attack the dev guys that are connecting in, take control of their clients or inject into their comms going backwards and forwards, you can then get a foothold to start attacking the production system all through this. Okay, and here's a demo of a module that I wrote that uses this function call to execute arbitrary ABAP code. And the ABAP code in this case is executing the native SQL again. So you can write it to do whatever you want, but in this case it's running an ABAP code block that pulls back the hashes again for all users across all instances. You can get it to call operating system commands, and there are some modules available that do that, and again, embed an interpreter payload for you. External servers. External servers are SAP terminology for SAP gateways or SAP systems that expose RFCs. And they don't have to be a full-blown SAP stack. It can just be something you've programmed using the SDK, and clients can then use the SDK to call those. So they're quite common. And again, all RFC calls go through the gateway. They work in two different modes, started and registered, and this is something that Mariano found as well, which is basically in started mode, everything's statically configured, so you tell it where the other SAP servers are that it's going to talk to and communicate with and execute commands for. In register mode, anyone can dynamically register a new SAP RFC server, and you can do that just with using a program ID. But what you've got to do is DOS the legitimate server that's on the network. So it's not a great thing to do on a pen test for a client, but at least finding out this is possible and then just telling them about it is usually enough. In the Bispoit framework, the Python one from Mariano, there are some plugins that automate this, but I've never found a practical reason on a legitimate 10 test to do this, so I haven't ported these yet. Okay, there's another attack that's possible, and it's called the evil twin. And this is what I was saying about you set up a rogue server, DOS off the legitimate server, and flip the client-server relationship. So if the calling client calls you, instead of executing the RFC that they asked you to execute, you say, actually, will you execute this for me instead? And it could be an operating system command, it could be anything, and they'll have to honour that, and you can get a return shell. The second technique you can use is another attack called callback. Sorry, I've got them the wrong way around. I talked about evil. So evil twin is what you would do is just to capture and replay calls that are coming backwards and forwards. So you set up your rogue server, any calls coming in, you pretend to be the legitimate server, you inspect that traffic, you change it, you extract the data that you want, and then pass it on. The callback is what I just explained previously, is the same thing, but you flip that relationship and you say, will you execute this for me, instead of the other way around. Now, it doesn't have to be clients in the concept of a guy just using a client and tapping away. Other SAP servers in the environment can be clients. So if you can do this and you compromise one server, you can use this to set up a rogue server and compromise another actual SAP server running with SAP all privileges. And again, the two attacks are automated in Mariana's framework. Doing a quick time check. Okay, Webpacking 101. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail, there's too much to cover. But some basics you need to be aware of are the SAP management console. The thing that I was talking about earlier, we can enumerate the current lockout thresholds that are set. Usually put runs on port 513, 514 with a 2-digit identifier for the SAP instance that's running. That's what it looks like. It's just a Java management console. And if you connect to the web server where this is, you can also download the applet and run it locally for you, and you can get a lot of information without authentication. But what it's doing in the background is calling a whole bunch of SOAP services. There's a quick demo of one of Chris's modules that you can use to call back the current lockout policy. And all it's doing is pulling back configuration files and running a regular expression against them to find out what the threshold is. Hopefully with these, what I'm illustrating here is that you really don't need a lot of skill or expertise to be able to attack these systems. Everything's in Metasploit for you now. All you need to do is understand some basics and some connection details. The same web service can be used to execute operating system commands, to format information. This is a quick demo of using the same web service to pull back the configuration files, search through them for SAP system information. So you've got the SID there, the SAP system, you've got the patch list. Then we're going to extract usernames that are stored in some of the log files. With that username, we're then going to pass that to another script. It's going to brute force that user. And when we brute force that user, we're going to check his permissions to see if he's got OS execute permissions. If he's got OS execute permissions, we can then use that user to execute arbitrary system commands. Now, everything there, apart from the operating system command that you need to execute, doesn't require any authentication. So if you're on a network one of these and you see one of these web services listening, it's a trivial way to gain control of that system. And it should pop up. Is that in show there? MPLA set 123. And this is a Linux system. You see which one is the MPLA, the end user. The vulnerability that I mentioned earlier that Context found, they found it in another web service that's kind of related to the management console, which is a SAP host control, and this has a whole host of other SOAP web services. Which incidentally, again, if you access these through a browser and ask for the WSDL, it'll give you the WSDL back. I haven't gone through every SOAP service in this one yet, and there's a good 50 or 60 services that really need looking at. But they found a vulnerability in this one that allowed you to pass arbitrary commands to DBM Pi, and they used it and wrote a SAP module that will return a shell for you on a Windows system. I also wrote a module that will do the same thing on Linux, so just take your pick out which ones. Again, that doesn't require any authentication, but it's soon to be patched. Web servers in SAP land. So the transaction server is what we saw earlier that translates the SAP GUI into web pages. The ICM is the evolution of that, which is a fully functional sort of application server that you can have custom scripts to call web app code on remote servers. And they're all handled by something called the ICF, which is the Internet Connection Framework. There's again about 1,500 ICF services by default. If you misconfigure these things, they're all exposed to the internet, and there's a couple of scripts in Metasploit that will do a sort of Durbuster attack and force browse all these for you. The ICM also provides a SOAP interface to RFC. So what you've seen me do today with the other scripts over direct RFC connections, we can also now do using SOAP connections. So all of those are available again in the next couple of weeks. I'll submit to the framework again. We can do all the same attacks but over SOAP. And also in there is a whole bunch of stuff that I've not done with the RFC yet, which is like SMB relay stuff, arbitrary command execution stuff. There's just too many to demo. The web dispatcher, going back to the beginning of the diagram that I showed you with the SAP router, the network proxy, the web dispatcher is like an application proxy firewall. It's going to restrict which services you can execute and what paths you can navigate through, much akin to the same way that the SAP router was. This is the ACL for it, so if you're doing any reviews of these are often misconfigured as well. In fact, sometimes they're not even turned on, but they're pretty simple to follow: commit, deny, path, wildcards, etc. Sorry, I'm starting to whiz through some of these, but I'm running out of time. The SAP web servers support two different stacks. You can have ABAP and you can have J2E. Because they've now moved to this Java stack, a lot of the attacks that we had previously against different Java stack application servers, such as Apache, Tomcat, blah blah blah, they're all valid attacks now against SAP systems as well. So we've got stuff like Invoker Servlet, which the ERPScan guys released information about, but has been known for years against other similar stack servers. It's basically, can you see the XML config on there? Yeah. You see that the servlet itself, the servlet class direct, if it's called there, sorry, you can see the servlet mapping. The servlet mapping maps that servlet to a particular path. Now that path there is restricted. However, if you call the servlet direct, because enable invoker server globally is set, then you can still execute it. It's not as functional, it's not as pretty, and it depends exactly on what that servlet does on the leverage that you get. But it's always worth, if you know the exact path, calling them, because 9 times out of 10 you can execute that function without any authentication. This one's quite interesting, is the verb tampering. Now, if someone set up an application or a function on one of these Java stack SAP application servers, and they've misconfigured it, as in they've tried to block here, you can see the URL pattern admin star, and they've specified a HTTP method of get. And if you try and access that through the web browser, you'll get prompted for authentication. However, if you use it programmatically and send a head request, such as like Netcat, then it's not going to require auth, because the application server hasn't explicitly told to authenticate head requests. And that comes in quite interesting on something like the SAP portal, where they've got this config servlet that allows you to remotely create username users on the local system. And by default, this thing was just asking for authentication on GET. So if you get this on the local net and you're talking to it even on the internet, and you can call those functions using head requests, you can create a local administrative user with just 2 web requests. Okay. That's me pretty much done and covered with just under 5 minutes to spare. Stuff that I want to work on next is porting core security scaling classes to the framework. Some of Mariano's stuff. Incidentally, Mariano is releasing a new version of Bispoy next week with some extra goodies, so we'll see what's in there. And also some of the stuff that ERPScan guys were doing, which I didn't really get to cover much in the Web 2.0 section of the talk, is these application servers are riddled with typical application security bugs. If you know how to test web apps, you can test these application servers. They've got XML, XSS, XSE type attacks all right through, and the ERPScan guys were coming up with payloads to use XSE to drill through and launch some of these attacks. It'd be nice to wrap all those up. Also the RMI spy stuff with the P4 protocol, that's just ripe and no one's really been looking at it much. And they've just implemented a new solution called Solution Manager for administrating all the SAP servers in the environment, and that relies heavily on that protocol. Also some post-exploitation type stuff would be useful. Now the other thing is, I've done all this in Ruby so that other people can easily rip it off, reuse it and do their own thing. From one day to it takes about half an hour to 3 hours to create a new module that calls a new RFC function based on our code. So hopefully other people are going to start getting involved and knocking out their own code. So thank you everybody here for listening to me ramble on, and hopefully I didn't go too fast or miss too much stuff. And I just wanted to thank these guys because they're cool guys and they checked out my talk and give me lots of pointers. Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks. How long have you been doing SAP assessments and stuff?
I started doing SAP assessments a few years ago when I worked for a company called Diagonal that had an arm that did SAP implementations. And I said, what do you do about the security of it? I said, we don't need to do anything because SAP said it was secure. So right then I thought it was worth looking at. But to be honest, I've only been doing these modules since about Christmas. Just because, again, I joined a new company. They turned around and said, you know a little bit about SAP, and you start pen testing for this client. And I had to go from 0 to hero in no time. And I didn't want to do it all on my own. I'm quite lazy. So I put all that info together to train the internal team to get them to start working on it.
Yeah, because what I'm curious about, I mean, you'll see systems that are fairly old and some that are not so old, maybe some that are quite newly installed.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you see any trends on what do people do they install it better? I mean, do they set it up better if it's newer? Or
no.
Is it worse? It's like does it get better over time or worse over time? As you know.
Okay, you don't buy SAP on a CD
right.
and install it and follow a config guide. What you normally do is hand over a hell of a lot of money to system integrators, and they're the guys that are going to put it in for you. And the contract says they need to get it up and running by any time because you invest in all this money to improve your business processes and to basically make it easier for you to make money or keep making the same amount of money without a headache. So all they care about is getting it up and running and working. They don't secure it, and it doesn't really matter to them if it is secure. When you take ownership of it from a system integrator, a lot of the times as well, if you make those changes to make it secure and break something or whatever, you don't put them to support. So normally, from the second it's gone in, the configuration doesn't change much. There are reports that you can run in SAP that will tell you, just like on a Windows desktop, how many patches do I need, what shall I install, and it can sort of do it automatically for you. You're not going to do this on a mission critical system that's running your entire business. It's hard enough to get to test it, let alone allow someone to run a report and say automatically change all the code in my system that you've just released and not tested. So a lot of people don't have the manpower or the understanding to do it. So that's why you find a lot of these vulnerabilities exist in SAP systems for years, because no one changes them. And the other thing is, they don't think anyone can get to them. It might be core to their business, but they don't really understand about all these connectors and the attack surface that it has. They don't really understand that there are ways to programmatically automate the GUI. They just don't really get it. So the trend really in recent years has been to patch the most critical vulnerabilities that someone shouts about, the stuff that's internet connected, but internal system, more often than not, no. Now interestingly, people don't want to spend all that money on buying these systems or going through the headache of integration. So what they'll do is go to outsourcers, and there's quite a few of them, and you can basically go to them and say, here's a lump of cash, you host my SAP system in your safe, secure data center and look after it for me. And a little bit of a war story as well. I went down to test, and I tested locally and I tested remotely from all these different client networks, and it was segregated, or appeared to be segregated quite well from these little network blocks I was given access to. When I went up to the main office where the help desk was and just sat there and plugged in, all of a sudden I found I could see all those client networks because they were too lazy. They'd opened up the firewall so they could remote into each one of the client networks, bridging the same internet network they were on. When I told them about this and how silly it was, and they said, that's great, we're really good, really happy you came down, all the advice is awesome, what we're going to do that now is package it up and put a value-added service and charge for that.
Yeah, charge for common sense. Alright, so but you don't see that systems that have been running for a long time is getting better over time.
No, for sure. And a lot of this stuff that I'm showing you is misconfiguration stuff, or it's exploiting features. They're not going to change the way the system works just because it can be abused. And most of the protection and countermeasures is to make sure that you can't communicate with the attack surface, make sure it's suitably authenticated and authorized and audited and logged and monitored and stuff. So you've really got to start bringing these SAP systems into your security policies, which not a lot of people do.
Do you see that SAP is starting to release patches more often or patch quicker?
Yeah, people are kicking them a lot more.
Yeah.
But I don't think they
care about it.
That's
I know that people are screaming hard, but
Yeah, some of the guys I've dealt with on the SAP security team are nice guys.
yeah.
I wouldn't say that there's a corporate policy right now to say that they care about the things we care about, but they're definitely fixing things. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, well, the only way would be to get the customers to scream hard enough about it, not just the security people. Well, the thing that I was thinking about, imagine the situation, just hypothetically, that you have somebody installing a big SAP system, and you're going to eventually put sensitive information in this, but you're not putting sensitive information in right now. So you're treating it with less security right now, and then you figure, well, by the time I'm going to put sensitive information in it, I'm going to segregate it, I'm going to make sure that it's more secure. What would you say to a scheme like that?
Don't be silly.
Right?
It's not.
Do you think it's possible? I mean, look at it this way.
It's perfectly possible. What you're saying is true.
Have you done forensics on SAP?
I haven't, but I have been called in to say I think we've been owned. Do you know how they got in? But I haven't actually done the forensic analysis.
Right. Do you think it's possible to clean up an SAP system once it's on?
Yeah. Well, you can hide your tracks pretty easily.
No, you think it's possible to clean up a system after system owner?
Oh,
once
I thought you were covering your tracks. No.
I'm curious.
Like any system, whether it's SAP or not, if I know that system's owned, it's burned, it's gone. I can't trust me or anyone else with a skill set to say every possible element of that person and anything they've done to that system is completely cleaned off. Just burn it and throw it out in the trash. It's the only way to be sure. Nip it from space.
Alright, I'm sure we have questions from the audience. I didn't bring the mic. Can I get the microphone, please? Keep forgetting. Yeah, well, we've had Mariano and Tunga here before.
Yeah, they're pretty cool guys and they're really open and helpful. And when I started doing this, I got in touch with them and they've been more than happy stuff. And I tried some stuff back.
I'm happy to see that there's so many people that are actually working on this because it's really needs to be addressed.
And it's fun. And like I said, I'm lazy. I was having to spend a lot of hard work breaking into systems on jobs because we were getting better. But this stuff is like going back to the 90s. Not difficult at all.
Do you see that there are more security professionals, I mean consultants and stuff, starting to work with SAP?
Since I started writing these modules and putting a few things out there, I've had more people in the industry contact me and telling me that they're getting called in to do a pen test. That never used to happen. People didn't get called in to do a pen test of the SAP system. They get called in to do a pen test and they find a SAP system and they say you should have that tested. And they don't even know who looks after it or owns it. But now there's been a lot of press that's stepping up and people are going, maybe we need to test it. The problem is, people just turn into their normal providers and normal suppliers and say, can you test my SAP system? Pen test is one thing, a full security assessment of one of these systems, and I am no SAP expert and I wouldn't sell myself to deliver that type of assessment because it's so ginormous and the attack surface is so massive and there's so many differences between the way it functions and how those can be abused that to do a full comprehensive assessment like that, you've really got to get in bed and know SAP. But to break into it as a pen tester, it's pretty easy.
All right. Audience, do you have questions for this? You're working with SAP here. All right, you're closest. Sorry.
So, are there solutions to misconfigurations and everything, or vulnerabilities, or is like?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do to secure the system, and even SAP themselves have a bunch of guides on like best practice configurations, what to lock down, what to change. You know what your attack surface is and how you can reduce that. The thing is, not a lot of people follow it. But if you followed it, you are making some good improvements. But in some cases, it requires like re-architecting the network. It requires looking for different solutions. So you imagine that some of the stuff we're doing over RFC, typically that would only be available in DMZ. But you get a user, a company that gets sold a product that now means that a lot of people don't understand they're using SAP. They go into Excel and they're just getting data sets out, or they're running some other application that's going to go off to the SAP system and get them the data and bring it back. Now, all the connectors that those are using exposes an attack surface to a local area network, which we all know you can get into a local area network remotely by lots of different techniques. So now you've got internet-born attackers on local area networks that have direct pipes into SAP systems from the internet. How do you work with a company to re-architect that and kick out a solution that they're using that is driving the core of their business. So you've got to look at minimizing and pushing SAP users to one side, put them in little silos and things like that, and also making sure that you're setting strong password policies, that the data segregation rules that you have, you're not just relying on SAP GUI to implement them. You know, if you've got sensitive data in one system and you don't want your finance guys getting access to it, or your sales guys getting access to the finance guys' data, don't rely on this typical client model of SAP.
Just a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So your reports, your recommendations look like that?
Well, it's hard because I don't want to shove in a lot of SAP notes and say do this, do this, do this, because I don't know what that advice is, or what it's going to break, or what it's not going to break. So my advice is usually around traditional architecture review, re-architect this, isolate that, make these configuration changes where I can get that information and tell them what the configuration changes should be. So for example, like the SOAP services that are enabled, you can change which ones require authentication. By default, a whole host of them are available unauthenticated. So you change that setting and now you have to be authenticated. But that service really shouldn't be available to anyone other than an administrator, and possibly shouldn't even be enabled full stop. So it's about minimizing your attack surface, making sure that you're appropriately authenticated. All the same stuff that you churn out for any network or app assessment you do. I'm not giving SAP specific stuff or saying this SAP note will fix it. I might include it and say, you've got access to it, I haven't. If you want me to have a look at it and tell you, then get it to me. But I can't really give you 100% that'll fix your problem.
I had a question. You said that this was like going 15 years back. Have you gotten any sort of shoot the messenger responses to showing off all these things and hacking on Metasploit modules and everything?
I hope it's not showing off. I hope it's more. Yeah. No. I mean. Well, I have spoken with the SAP security team and told them what I'm up to and given them access to the code and blog posts and stuff. And to be honest, they sort of track a lot of people that are talking about SAP and getting in touch themselves and ask for copies of the slides and the presentation materials, which they've had, and they've asked me not to talk about some things, which I ignored, because I don't think these are, the stuff I'm talking about aren't patchable vulnerabilities. They're architectural type stuff or feature abuse, and with the example of the verb tampering and things like that, to me that's been out for over a year. People know about it. They say that the payload hasn't been publicly released, but it's not hard to jump from A to B, is it? If someone tells you that a head request works to call a function, and you know the function name, you don't need me to put it on a slide to tell you how to do it. So, yeah, they're kind of friendly, but I said basically in return, I'm quite happy to share everything with them, talk out, just give me access to all the SAP notes, so I can be a better consultant and a better researcher. And they told me that they'd really like to, but no. So I told them I'd really like to, but no.
All right, we're running short on time. Thank you very much, David.